Hi, my name is Theolyn and welcome to my book review. Today's book review is about Madame Bovary, written by Gustave Flaubert, and Madame Bovary is in the public domain. So, without further ado, I want to make mention that there is a big, heavy thunderstorm. It's raining cats, dogs, frogs, tadpoles, I don't know what else. So if the power goes out or if you hear thunder, lightning, and rain, that's what it is. So I want to talk about this book, and if you're here because you think, oh, she's read it so I don't have to, oh, stop right there. Because if your teacher was clever enough to assign you to read Madame Bovary, please do yourself a favor and read it, because it will help you be a better writer. It might even help you to be a better reader, and it has a lot to offer to you, even over more than one reading. I think that every time I've read this book, I've gotten a little something more out of it, a little more appreciation out of it, a lot more appreciation for Flaubert's ability to craft a story and to craft a scene, in the sense of getting in the an omniscient view almost, and in the view of each person and their thoughts and feelings, and then very easily segues into the next person's thoughts and feelings, and you cannot even tell how he did it. He's a magician. So having said that, his language is very detailed. It's very specific prose. It can be a little bit tedious at times, but it's usually, I guess, in the regular French, filled with lots of little puns and innuendos and things that just kind of go over the head of the English translations. So he really misses nothing in the details, and the devil is often in the details. So I'm going to give you a real wide overview of this story, and then maybe in subsequent videos tell you a little bit more about maybe how Madame Bovary is applicable today, or a little more deep dive into it, but this is going to be a grand overview of the book. Madame Bovary is an overly emotional woman who finds herself married to a doctor, and it's basically a story about how she struggles to overcome living with this man and how her dreams are crushed. So that's the grand overview, and you think, oh wow, this is like Real Housewives of Rouen or something, but yeah, basically there's a lot more to it here. Like I said, in a later series we can maybe discuss the applicability to today, and also the strengths of Madame Bovary, the reason why people dislike Madame Bovary. We can go there. So right now I want to introduce Charles Bovary. He's introduced in the novel as when he was a school pupil, and they describe him as a country lad who's ill at ease, and that he's in an ill-fitting suit in this new place, and he's kind of made fun of by his peers. He's socially awkward, he's stammering, he's overly attentive to the teacher, though. He's like almost like he's at a sermon. He's, that like fixated. He wants to learn, but he just, I don't know, he's just kind of dull. And whenever they ask him his name is Charles Bovary, but back in the day, Chas, like Chas, was the typical shortening of the name Charles, and Bovary. So they ask him his name, he goes Chabot, like that, and then all the kids are up and they just make fun of him, Chabot, 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 and that's like how it starts. It's like he's being mocked by his peers. And then also Flaubert does this brilliant job of describing the children's school caps, and after you read it you're like, oh my god, he's kind of like describing Charles Bovary. This is how Flaubert describes the children's caps. Kind of snarky. It was one of those head coverings of a composite nature, in which may be found elements of the woolen cap, the chapska, the round hat, the otter fur cap, and the cotton bonnet. One of those sorry objects, in short, whose mute ugliness has a certain depth of expression, like the face of an imbecile. Yeah, that's not snarky. So anyway, Charles' mother, who we'll call Mama Bovary, just to keep it quick and simple, she is rather a control freak, because her husband, we'll call him Papa Bovary, is kind of a spendthrift. He's useless, he's a dandy, he's eventually cheated on her, and she's taken over all the accounts and all the she's taken control basically, and she has one child, which is Charles, as an only child, and she spoils him half to death. They don't even put him into formal education until he's a little bit older, and they send him off to Rouen, and in her mind he's going to study medicine. Like, it's like he's going to be a doctor, you know. And without thinking that maybe he wasn't naturally suited to that profession, doesn't matter. Mama Bovary is a control freak, so she sends him off to Rouen. Previous to that, the only school lessons he had were like really short and irregular. So when he gets to Rouen, it's not for lack of trying, because they say that he was the type to listen but not to follow. And I think they mean like follow it in his head, because he would follow like a cow, but he just kind of like doesn't always follow what you're saying. He's listening to you, but he's not always getting it. So that's how he's described right in the first chapter. Without a natural inclination to medicine, it takes Charles Bovary 5 years to pass his exam, and the first time he fails it. So that's how we're set up, learning a little back history of Charles. So Mama Bovary, being the controlling type that she is, finds a dying doctor in the city of Tostes to for Charles to, once he passed his exams, to kind of just slide into that practice with the existing clients and set up. Because in most small towns, they had one doctor at most. So she finds someone that's dying, and she's like, okay, you're going to move here, you're going to get in here. And she also proceeds to find him his first wife. I mean, she's a piece of work, by the way, and that's a whole other subject. But she finds like an old, dry woman that has a dowry, you know, because Charles doesn't have any money. So she finds this older lady named Eloise, who, like I said, is dry, is how she's described, older, has a dowry, and she sets them up. They get married. But turns out that Eloise has some opinions of her own. Imagine that. Eloise has some opinions. She's mighty controlling herself. So Mama Bovary, she has a little surprise in store for her. So to Mama Bovary's chagrin, the first wife she sets up Charles with has opinions of her own. She tries to control Charles, how he eats, how he dresses, how he speaks, how he opens his letters. But she also gets him to give her a little medicine at night, and a little more on that later. This was Flaubert's description of when he was married to his first wife, and Charles's mother, Mama Bovary, came to visit. Charles's mother came occasionally to visit them, but after the first few days, the daughter-in-law seemed to rouse into her to irritation against her son, and then, like a pair of knives, they devoted themselves to slashing him with their criticisms and observations. It was wrong of him to eat so much. Why always offer a drop to drink to everyone who came along? What stubbornness, refusing to wear flannel? So this is how the story actually begins. This is how Madame Bovary begins. We're in 19th century France. It's rural. Charles is receiving a late night letter. He's probably in his stocking in his bed cap, and he's getting this late night letter that a farmer has broken his leg. And so he rouses himself and prepares to go to the farm of the Bertaux. That's the name of the residence of Emma and her father. Her father's a farmer. He's a pretty well-to-do farmer. And as it's richly described how Charles sees the farm, and it's like this is gleaming and that is gleaming, and they have peacocks and all this stuff, and he's impressed with how well that Emma's father is taking care of their farm. So luckily for both the farmer and for Charles, the leg that the farmer has broken is only fractured, and Charles can figure out how to deal with that. He splints the leg up, and all is well. After 48 days, the farmer is cured. So Charles didn't need to go to the farm at the Bertaux for 48 days. He continues to go there because he sees that the farmer has a pretty young daughter. And I don't think Charles was necessarily a dog at this point. I think it was simply that he had a patient that he was actually successful at treating, and he did kind of eye Emma, and he did gussy up a bit when he would go to their residence, but the farmer hadn't quite paid yet. And so it was just like kind of kept the relationship going. This is how Flaubert describes Charles' view of Emma when he sees her for the first time. Charles was surprised by the whiteness of her fingernails. They were shiny, thin at the tips, more carefully cleaned than the Dieppe ivories, and almond-shaped. Her hand, however, was not beautiful, not white enough, perhaps, and somewhat rough at the knuckles. And it was also too long and lacking in the soft variations of line in its contours. The thing about her that was beautiful was her eyes. Although they were blue, they looked black because of their lashes, and her glance met yours frankly and with a candid assurance. And here's how Flaubert describes Emma whenever she asks Charles for a drink, to take a drink with her. Everyone loves this, so I'll go ahead and read it. So, as in the country custom, she invited him to drink something. He declined. She insisted, and at length offered, laughing, to take the glass of liqueur with him. She went then to fetch a bottle of curacao from the cupboard, took out 2 small glasses, filled one to the rim, poured almost nothing into the other, and having touched it to his, raised it to her lips. As it was almost empty, she leaned back to drink, and her head thrown back, her lips parted, her throat elongated. She laughed at being unable to taste anything, while the tip of her tongue, thrust out between delicate teeth, licked tiny drops from the bottom of the glass. She was a sensualist. And meanwhile, while this is going on, Eloise is becoming a little bit sharp as to why Charles is gussying up to go to this residence and, take care of the farmer and all this stuff. And so she gets wind that there's a young daughter there, and she's not happy, and she's really jealous. At the same time, Eloise's, I think it's her father, passes, and she's supposed to have gotten like an inheritance that she doesn't get. And Charles's father gets mad about this, as if he would be the beneficiary of it. But he gets all mad and says all kinds of nasty things about Eloise, or to Eloise. And let me find what the exact quote was. Called her bony and said that she was a harness not worth her hide. And she was terribly hurt by that, hurt that Charles wasn't sticking up for her, hurt, jealous about Charles's attention to the Berthold residence, and she pretty much up and dies. Like, she up and passes out and dies. And so typically everyone starts feeling sad for poor widower Charles. His business picks up a little bit. First time of his life, he's not controlled by anybody for a few weeks, and he's kind of like getting his footing of like, oh, okay, I don't have a wife now, and all right. And that's when Emma's father comes to visit Charles, and he has the full payment, and he has a turkey. And so they start talking about grief, and Emma's father's talking about the death of his wife, and Charles is talking about the death of his wife, and they bond, and he's like, well, it'd be great if you really came back to the Berthaud, and, Emma misses you and all this stuff. Right. So Charles comes back to the Berthaud and starts kind of, I would say, wooing Emma, if you want to call it that way. It's pretty dryly put, like in the sense of like she'd go around and show him like things she got when she was at the convent, and like show him little things of her mother's, and just like little doodads and hoo-ha's, and they did really simple things together, but Charles was pretty enamored of her. So Charles finally gets up the nerve to ask for Emma's hand in marriage. He asks Emma's father, and he doesn't actually even ask. He's like stuttering and stammering and trying to work around it, and the father's like, yes, okay, go ahead and ask her, you know what I mean? He's like, okay. He's like, he has no cojones, and so the father's like, yeah, okay, you can marry my daughter, but if she wants you to, because he believed that women should have, the right to choose their husband. So he says, here's what we'll do. I'll go back to the farm. You stand out here in the field. It'll take me, almost a half hour to get in there and get settled. And then if I open the shutter, it's a yes, and then you can proceed. So he's so cowardly. It's like that person you say, oh, I like that guy. Can you go find out if he likes me? I mean, that's pretty cowardly. So anyway, after 19 minutes, the shutter opens, and so, okay, he's going to get married. So that's this great freaking love affair, right? Basically, I think that Emma was just eager to escape the country life at this point. She wanted to have a beautiful night wedding with torches, in the moonlight and all this stuff, and her dad was like, dial it back a little. They did have like everyone in the village, and everybody on both sides of the family came, and all kinds of carts. They feasted for 2 solid days, and actually more. And then at the end of that, Charles had to get back to work in Tost. So they kick up their heels and have a good time. And after the first night of their wedding, like Charles is like smitten to death with her, and it's like everybody's looking at her the next day, and it's just like nothing. Like, so that gives you any indication. Well, Emma goes with Charles to Toast to see her new house, her new digs. You know, she's getting out of the country and more into a kind of a city life, and she doesn't really know what to expect. And she's greeted with a servant. He's had her forever, Nastasi, which really isn't mentioned that much, but she is so disappointed because she goes up to the bedroom to see the bedroom for the first time, and the first wife's wedding bouquet is still out. And, you know, I guess back in the day you knew a wedding bouquet. I mean, he hadn't even thought to prepare the bedchamber for her arrival, and by getting rid of his previous wife's bouquet, even to put it in the attic. And she was just like, what the heck? This is how Flaubert describes Emma when she finds the first wife's bouquet in the bedroom. Emma went up to the bedrooms. The first was unfurnished, but the second, which was the master bedroom, had a mahogany bed in a red curtained alcove. A shell-studded box decorated the chest of drawers, and on the secretary near the window there was a bouquet of orange blossoms tied in a white satin ribbon, standing in a pitcher. It was a bridal bouquet. The other wife's bridal bouquet! She looked at it. Charles noticed it. He picked it up and took it to the attic while seated in an armchair. Emma thought of her own bridal bouquet, which was put away in a cardboard box, and wondered dreamily what would be done with it if perchance she happened to die. See, she has that romantic morbidity, almost like the Germanic folks do. Emma sets about straight away to change the house, you know, the way she would like it. And over time, we find that Charles has allowed Emma to spend all the dowry money in fixing up the house at Toast, at least fixing it up to her taste. Flaubert describes Charles as re-chewing his happiness with Emma's charm and her beauty. And almost in a way like, I hate to liken it to this, but almost like if you eat a hot dog and you burp it up and you experience it again. But that's almost like he was just so pleased with Emma that he's just like re-chewing his happiness, and there was no rapture on Emma's part. No, not at all. So then at this part in the story, we're shown Emma's history. So she had been schooled at an Ursuline convent, and she had come back home to help her dad with the farm. Her mother had passed. And also, while she was at the convent, she'd read a lot of novels, and someone had shown up at the convent and got everybody into reading these romance novels, and she was literally weaned for 6 solid months on romance novels. They said her hands were black because she would just read and read and read the romance novels. And then she kind of started believing that that was how life was. And like she wanted to experience like emotions and extremes and lovers and kisses and fairy tales, and historical figures like Joan of Arc were the things she aspired to be. And she was a sensualist. I mean, they don't say it, but that's how I think. She was like a sensualist at heart, and she was just aching for passion. And at that time, the convent started to like irritate her, but with its discipline, and after a while they were kind of like, oh, you're not really suited to be a nun, and they just kind of like sent her on back to the Berto. So when she finally meets up with Charles, she had been like 2 years out of the convent, but her head was still filled with all this romance and stuff, and she was really at that point tired of country life. Post-marriage, Charles found Emma to be wonderful and beautiful and smart, and she found him to be the dullest dog in town. She was bored. She couldn't define her uneasiness. She found his prattle to be tedious. She thought he was dull in thought. She thought he was incurious. She wanted a man who would initiate her into like the world, like lovemaking and experiencing things, experiencing different cultures and things like that. And that was the antithesis of Charles, what he wanted out of life. And she just began to like really mentally struggle with the banalities of life with him, and the monotony of the small town of Tost, and the same wretched conversations, and overhearing discussions of his medical patients, and the non-sentimentality. And she was just like, ugh, yuck, why did I marry him? And that is in the book, like, why, oh God, did I marry him? And to add to her unhappiness, Emma Bovary and Mama Bovary, of course, they don't get along. Because see, Mama Bovary didn't pick Emma. So they don't get along, and when Mama comes to visit, Mama seeks to give Emma lessons and advice, you know. And they both really like disliked each other intensely, but they had to act polite, so it almost like comes out like hisses. And, you know, old Charles with no cojones is like in between two women, and he's not doing anything to like make the situation any better. He was stuck in the middle of two feuding women, no cojones. And when Emma would go into the garden alone, she would literally, and this is like a couple times where you have to give Emma props for trying. Like, even though it's odd trying, but she was so emotional and fantastical. Like, she would go out in the garden and like come up with poems and songs and try to convince herself of romance with Charles and like sing to him and just all this nonsense to try to like make herself love him, and she just couldn't. She just couldn't. This is how Flaubert describes Emma trying to hypnotize herself into liking or loving Charles. Nevertheless, according to the theories in which she believed, she tried to inspire herself with love. By moonlight in the garden, she would recite all the impassioned verses she knew by heart, and sighing would sing him the melancholy adagios. But afterwards, she found herself as calm as before, and Charles seemed neither more loving nor more stirred by it. But Emma's efforts to hypnotize herself into loving her husband failed, and she deeply regretted marrying Charles, and I think she realizes, you know, I'm emotional and just he's not. So one day Emma did have one little frisson, one little slice of excitement when Charles had lanced a marquise. He had an abscess that Charles lances, and so they get an invitation to this fancy ball, and it is like literally such a big deal in this novel about the ball that Emma goes to with Charles in their dog cart when everybody else has their carriages. But anyway, they go to this big mansion, and they've got marble, and you know, they've got people waiting on you, and they've got waltzes, and she never had a pomegranate before, and they have iced champagne, and they have maraschino ice, and you know, whenever the people get hot, the servants would take like a chair and bust out the window so the air could come in. I mean, it was just all this extreme emotion and everything she loved. And that day, she worried that day down, that memory of that day. She would think about that day and liken that day and try to use that day to up her spirits. And just like, I bet that by the end of her life, that day was threadbare because she had thought about it so much. That was like, at that point of her life, the epitome of her life. So Emma tries to interest her husband in other things. She urges him to think of himself not as just like some country doctor, but to try to be more. And Charles is like older than Emma, and he's comfortable with his job. I mean, as comfortable as you can be is like not being very good at it. But anyway, he's comfortable with his job. He's comfortable with his station in life. He sees little sense in putting on any kind of airs for anybody. He's content. So like, why isn't she content? You know, that's kind of like where he's coming from. And she, to her discredit, she never just puts it plain to him about how unhappy she is. She never like puts it in plain language for Charles as to why she is so unhappy. Because I think that Charles would have tried. So then what happens? Emma becomes pregnant because, you know what, back then they didn't really use birth control. And so Charles was so ecstatic and pleased, and Emma not so much, as it's important to have a boy to most families of that day to pass on the family name and all that good stuff. Charles wanted a boy but wasn't, you know, going to be a jerk about it. But basically she felt that females were hampered in a society with no say in their future, and I think she was right. She absolutely was hampered in her society. And she didn't want to have a girl, and she had a girl. So, to appease his wife, Charles agrees to move because he feels like, you know, she's just not happy. He recognizes she's not unhappy, but he doesn't try to figure out why. And so he agrees to move to a bigger city called Yonville, which is kind of funny because when you read it in the French, it's literally like a single street. So, you know, it's like they're moving to one of the bigger cities, but it's really just like one long street. So Yeah, Yawnville, if you get what I mean. So they moved to Yawnville, which is way bigger than Tost, I suppose. But still, he's going to be the main doctor there. And some of the people in Yawnville are Omé, the druggist, who will like kind of work hand in hand with Dr. Bovary. Hello. And then, and he also, by the way, he kind of sucks up to Dr. Bovary because they give you a tiny little backstory that Omé was once reprimanded for practicing medicine without a license. And so he sucks up to Dr. Bovary probably just as kind of like as a protection and to kind of maybe work with him or underneath him or hell, I don't know. But they just do add that little bit. He does kind of become friends with Charles. So, and then you've got people like Léon Dupuis, who is a notary. And there are some houses that people have taken in borders, and Omé is one of them, and he has Léon as like a boarder on his second floor. And then you have people like LaRue, which I guess would be like a haberdasher or a salesperson. And LaRue is, I guess, the antagonist in the story if people don't think Emma is the antagonist. I personally don't think Emma is the antagonist. But, oh Lord, this LaRue. He always encourages Emma, and maybe other people before him, to use credit instead of paying him off. And then it's kind of like his thing to get you so upside down, and then he'll foreclose on your house or whatever kind of thing you have, any kind of asset you have. And all she knows is, you know, this guy's coming and he's got these great silks and he's like, oh, you know, you look beautiful in this, and he's like rubbing her cheeks with it, and you know, she's all into all that emotional and sensualism. So she was ripe for the plucking of old LaRue. And over the series of the novel, Emma indulges into affairs, and I'm just going to really quick give you the overview of them, and then I'll talk in order. The first is a flirtation with Léon Dupuis, who is the notary at that time. And the second is an actual full-fledged affair with Rodolphe Boulanger. And he's an aristocrat that's land rich, money poor. So, and then later again, when it stops with Rodolphe, she takes up with Leon in another city. And that becomes a physical relationship. And neither of these men, much to her chagrin, neither of these men have any intention of maintaining a serious relationship with her or running away with her or taking her away from her problems. Where have we heard this before, right? Okay, so just to go back to a linear fashion, initially Léon Dupuis and Emma, they meet kind of in the daily routine of things. Charles would arise at a certain time and have his meals at a certain time. Oh, you know how it is. You know how it is in a boring little town. Everybody will sit and have their meals, and then they'll play cards and all this stuff. You know what I mean? So she meets Léon, and Léon is extremely emotional like Emma and loves singing and loves reading and loves talking about travel and all kinds of stuff. So he's like pushing all Emma's buttons, right? And he actually feels this way. He's not necessarily a fraud or anything, but you know, he shares her interests. They read aloud to each other. They read like romantic stuff while the others are playing cards and things like that. And I mean, he gives her life a charm. And like I said, he pushes her romantic button. And you know, at first Leon really likes Emma. It's not that he doesn't like Emma. It's just that after a while he realizes that true intimacy with her is not going to be a possibility because she's married and has a child. Okay? Emma, you got to give her credit because she tries, as sometimes a little convent girl in her comes out and she tries and she attempts to repent or get her life back on some kind of a track, and she thinks, you know, I miss the convent, you know, I don't like what's going on with Leon, here, let me go to the church. And she finds the priest there, and she really like tries to open up to him to tell her how miserable she is, but he is so distracted by the kids that he's got running all around in the pews and stuff that I think he's going to put through catechism. So he's like he's like yelling at this one and yelling at this one, and he's like literally poo-pooing every word she says because she's like trying to tell him how miserable he is. And he's like, well, you have bread, right? And she's like, yeah, but what about those people that have bread but they still have this? And he's like, well, you have fire in winter, right? And she's like, yeah, I do, but... And he just like poo-poos her, and then he's like, I don't know what his problem was, but she came to him with a spiritual issue, and he was too busy worrying about busting butts on the little kids in the pews than to deal with the one lamb of his herd of 100 that was scurrying away and then coming back saying, help me, and he just like blows her off. And I had no appreciation for that at all. Leon leaves the city. Leon up and leaves, and it devastates Emma. But she gets on. I mean, she lays around supine. She's all in lassitude, all laying around, depressed. I mean, he describes it as she felt night on all sides. Charles, not knowing what to do, has his mother come over, and they put their heads together, and in their solemn remedy, they decide, you know what? Emma needs to quit reading her romance novels. No wonder she doesn't get better. Wah! Enter Rodolphe Boulanger. He comes to Dr. Bovary's office to have his servant bled. And back in those days, they believed that if you had any kind of ill humor or any kind of problem, that you could be bled into a basin through a vein, and then they would stop the pressure and you would get better. And so Rodolphe takes a look at Emma and sees this peach and sees that she's beautiful, that she's smart, and that she's bored with her husband. And this is how he describes how he views Emma. Gaping after love like a carp on a kitchen table. And boy, was he going to give her some water. So basically, as Rodolphe is leaving Dr. Bovary's office, he's already contemplating in his mind how he's going to woo her, how he's going to conquer her, how he already has a mistress, but that other mistress isn't as pretty as Emma, and he goes for it. At this point, they talk about this agricultural fair in the novel, and it's kind of tedious in a way because they have a lot of speeches and things, and you've got cattle, and they're talking about manure, and then they're interspersing this with Rodolphe getting Emma alone and filling her ears with manure. So, but she is aching to hear what she wants to hear. She is dry, and she is just being filled with all this kind of fancy talk and talk of passion, and she just falls right into it, and they enter promptly into an affair. So Emma and Rodolphe enter into a physical affair, and she is besotted with him. They, of course, have intimate relations, and it even becomes as crazy as him coming to her window at night and throwing sand at the Bovary master bedroom window, hitting the shutter. And when Emma hears it, and she is pretending to read, and she gets Charles settled in the bed, and he says, "Come to bed, darling," and she says, "Oh, let me finish reading." And then once he begins to snore, she exits the residence and goes and has sex with Rodolphe in the garden. So the affair goes on and off for about 4 years, and it's one thing for Emma to want Rodolphe to, say, trade locks of hair or little doodads, or for her to buy him gifts. And it's another when she starts kind of wanting a ring from him, and she starts wanting him to take care of her and run away with her. And, it becomes to where she feels subjugated by Rodolphe. She feels almost like a slave to his love. She feels weak to him. And the more she loves Rodolphe, the crappier she starts treating Charles. As if she could treat him crappier, but... And then Emma has a moment where she's repenting over Rodolphe, and during that moment, Homais, the chemist, gets this brilliant idea that Charles should fix the porter's leg. The porter has a club foot, and his name is Hippolyte. And Homais gets this brilliant idea that Charles should, as the grand doctor, should fix this poor porter's leg, his club foot, and that he'll be he'll be famous throughout the lands, and it'll raise the esteem of the village, and la-di-di-di-da. And so he gets this idea in his head. He tries to get Charles interested in it. He gets Emma interested in it to get Charles interested in it, because Emma could be the wife of a famous doctor. And this appeals to Emma, and she tries to put effort into her relationship again with her husband. As you might suspect, back in mid-19th century France, an operation on a club foot is kind of risky. And of course, it goes awry. I mean, it's demonstrated in the novel many times that Charles is not the sharpest tool in the shed, and whenever he does the surgery, he cuts the wrong tendon, gangrene sets in, and another doctor from a different city has to come in and amputate the leg up to the knee. and things do not go well. Emma is not pleased with her husband. She feels bad for what's happened to Hippolyte. And in order to, I guess, kind of try to fix the situation, she goes to LaRue, that shady haberdasher salesman, and has him buy a super fancy leg for Hippolyte that has like a spring-loaded, it's like a leg with spring loads, which was a big deal at the time, and all kinds of fancy stuff. And when Hippolyte gets that, he doesn't even want it so fancy. He doesn't even want to wear it every day because I think it has like a special kind of boot and a part of a pant leg or something. So he wants like a plain wooden leg. So actually, she ends up buying 2 legs for Hippolyte through LaRue. As you can imagine, she's completely disgusted with Charles at this point. She's spent 300 francs on the fancy wooden leg for Hippolyte. I do believe she might have spent another 200 for the plain wooden leg for Hippolyte. And so she goes back to Rodolphe for solace. Monsieur Leroux takes this opportunity to have a little chit-chat with Emma about how much she's rung up. And he's talking about the different fancies she's purchased and the price of Hippolyte's leg. And Emma wants to purchase a riding crop or whip for Rodolphe as a gift because she's newly smitten with him, and for the whopping sum of 200 francs, which is pretty much the price of Hippolyte's leg. And so Emma should have been put on notice because very soon thereafter, LaRue comes into her and says, "I need the whole amount of everything you owe, the leg, all the stuff you've bought. I need you to pay me right now." And then she just amazingly, or I'll take your stuff back. And she said, "Fine, take the stuff back." And he's like, "Well, even the whip?" And she has to pause because she realizes that she's given the whip to Rodolphe. And then also she lets it be known through her actions that essentially the whip wasn't for her husband. And so then LaRue has blackmail on Emma, which isn't good. This should have put Emma on notice that she is going to have to pay the piper. But for some reason, and just by chance, one of Charles's clients pays that day, and so she goes and pays off LaRue in full and feels like everything's fine and dandy. So basically, as time goes on, Emma begins to buy more and more gifts for her lover, Rodolphe. At different points in the story, she keeps buying herself luxuries, rewarding herself for what she feels like she's been so put upon having to put up with in her life. And she's buying lemon to bleach her fingernails. She's buying fancy dresses, fancy fabric, fancy everything, being hand sewn and from Rouen. And it's adding up to be quite a large amount. After a fight with her own husband, Mama Bovary comes to a visit to Charles Bovary's household. And Emma Bovary and Mama Bovary do not get along, and Mama finds fault with everything Emma does. And they get into quite a little spat, and Emma is forced to apologize. Charles tells her to apologize to Mama Bovary, which she does, but then she goes and lays down in the bed like a child, face down in the bed, and cries her little heart out. And after that, she decides she must run away, and Rodolphe has got to help her get away from this misery of her life. This is one example of how Flaubert describes Emma's despair and Charles's inability sometimes to even notice it. The exasperating thing to her was that Charles had not the air of suspecting her anguish. His conviction that he was making her happy seemed a witless insult, and his sense of security a further ingratitude. For whose sake, then, was she being virtuous? Wasn't it for him, the obstacle to all felicity, the cause of all misery, and in a way, the sharp-pronged buckle of the strap that was lashed about her? So she expended upon him alone the multiple hatreds that rose out of her frustrations, and each effort to lessen them served only to augment them, for that futile exertion added itself to the other sources of despair and contributed even further to her estrangement from him. Her own natural gentleness gave her spasms of rebellion. Domestic mediocrity drove her to lustful fantasies. marital tenderness to adulterous desires. She would have liked Charles to beat her so that she might more justly detest him and be revenged. She was alarmed sometimes by the appalling conjectures that arose in her mind, and she must go on smiling, listening to herself repeat that she was happy, pretend to be happy, let him believe that she was. I mean, how miserable are you that you hope your husband beats you so that you can justify your dislike for him? The woman was very unhappy. To Rodolphe, at this point, the 4-year relationship has become monotonous, and Emma has become quite needy. She is just always clinging to him, always trying to soak him for emotions. Now she's coming to him with problems with her husband, and he's just kind of like, a roller coaster is exciting to ride, but if you're riding it every single day, you're going to get bored of it. So he realizes that at this point in her life, Emma has never been more beautiful, and he does see the beauty in her. She's actually just glowing with the idea of running away with Rodolphe, and she begs him to take her away. Calgon, take me away. But he dithers. He says, okay, I'll do it, but then he keeps putting the date off, and you wonder why in the world didn't she notice that he just keeps delaying their runaway date. And he waits until the day before they are scheduled to run away to give her the Dear Jane letter. Meanwhile, thinking that she's going to run off with Rodolphe, she's gone to LaRue and bought a travel bag, a cape, all these different accoutrements to run away and have him store them. And so now, with getting this Dear Jane letter, she just can't stand it. She is utterly crushed. She falls into a very deep depression. I mean, this time it can't be denied. The woman is depressed. Let's talk about the Dear Jane or Dear Emma letter. Rodolphe spends that day crafting this letter that he feels that he's going to let Emma know that he is not going to take her away, but he wants her to not come crying outside his place. So he decides to spend some time crafting a Dear Jane letter. And he takes it into account. They talk in the book, they let you know his thoughts while he's crafting this letter about what a pretty mistress she was. And he talked himself out of running away with her. He didn't want to take care of her. He didn't want to take care of her child because they were planning to take the child too. And he felt that it was just such a finely crafted letter, and he was talking about how he would be dragging her into an abyss if they were to run away, and that, forget me, dear, forget me, filled with all this florid language, like he was overcome with himself, and basically that he was saving her from himself, and that, he was so heartbroken that he was going to have to go away for a while, so she wouldn't come and show up and make a scene, basically, so he wouldn't be there. And what he does is he has the letter put into a basket of fruit, and he has his footman go and deliver this to the Bovary household. And knowing that, hey, we're supposed to be running away, when the fruit arrives, she knows that something's up, so she gets the letter and just falls into the deepest depression. Finally, Charles cannot deny that Emma is deeply unhappy. She falls into a total funk, unable to pretty much do anything or has the will to do anything. And he feebly attempts through time to indulge her whims, and he suggests, why don't we go to the Rouen Opera? Because he knew she liked music. And this is where another folly enters, because when they go to the Rouen Opera, who's there but Léon Dupuis, the one guy that she had her first mental affair with. And Léon, during his time in Rouen, has grown up. It's been 4 years, and he's had some experience in life, and he's sowing his oats, and he decides he's going to go for it. And he sort of subtly suggests that Emma stay for a second night at the opera, and knowing full well that Charles would have to go back to the village, leaving Emma in a strange city with him right outside. Emma engages in her tryst with Leon in Rouen. She invents a reason to go to the city continuously for piano lessons, And so she goes alone, and she tends to stay overnight. And it's the perfect opportunity for her to have Léon over and to spoil him with gifts and with affection. One could argue that the antagonist of the novel is Emma, and one could argue that it could also be Leroux, the guy, the haberdasher salesman guy that gets her in over her head with the credit. Because at this point, he has gotten her involved in buying silks, buying rugs, buying baubles for Léon in Rouen. She'd also refurnished the house in Yonville. She was just becoming over her head, over her pretty little bonnet in credit. And she is indulging in these piano lessons, fake, right? And Charles just doesn't suspect anything, and I think that also makes her incredibly bitter to him, that he's just not suspected these affairs. I mean, how strong can your love for someone be if you just cannot see that they're constantly cheating on you? Emma's life reaches a crescendo of misery because she becomes more and more needy with Léon, and Léon is still young. He's not fully mature. He is not willing to run away with Emma, to have to take care of Emma, leave his life for Emma, and she's just so darn needy that he ends up kind of just pushing her away. She starts kind of being a pest at his work, and he just basically says, "Leave me alone." And at that same exact moment, Leroux decides to try to foreclose on the Bovary assets. He claims that his debts, Leroux's debts, were being bought off by somebody else, and it wasn't his fault. So he had nothing to do with it. But all of a sudden, everybody, all the money lenders descend upon the Bovary home and assets and try to basically take everything. They go through the Bovary residence while she's diddling around trying to argue with Léon and Rouen. They go through the Bovary residence on Yonville and nail up the notice on the wall about the, I would say, bankruptcy, if you want to call it that. And they go through the residence and note every asset. They decide to leave Charles his medical instruments so he can keep practicing as a doctor, and his phrenology head, which are those heads. Oh, Lord have mercy. So he gets a notice that there is a big problem, and he's totally confused and has no idea and no explanation for how they've gotten into this situation. So she comes back, and she's totally freaked out, and she goes to Rodolphe because she thinks he has money. And she begs him, just begs him on her hands and knees, crying, knowing that they're not still involved, but begging him to at least just sell one thing, one tiny thing, just give me the money to pay off at least the interest on this debt, so to stop the foreclosure. And he doesn't do a thing to help her. So between Léon blowing her off and saying, quit pestering me, leave me alone, the foreclosure coming down, Bovary totally knows now something's wrong because they're starting to come in his house and pick through it like vultures. So hello, he can't deny there's a problem now. And then her going to Rodolphe and begging him for money, and him blowing her off without so much as a second thought, saying he didn't have the money. She just totally falls into a deep depression. She just freaks out, basically. She has a break. And she goes to Homais, who is the chemist, goes to his place and gobbles arsenic. So she steals the arsenic and she gobbles it down. Oh, Lord. So this is an act of pure desperation. She's basically killing herself for her own ideals. It is such a sad situation. In eating the arsenic, it turns her tongue black. She immediately becomes ill. And between Homais and Charles, the doctor, they cannot figure out what's wrong with her. And that's another thing. It's like, you got medical training, okay? But I think eventually it comes to light what her problem is. But you just got to laugh kind of behind your hand the whole time about how bad of a doctor Charles is. Oh, so Emma, it's a long kind of death, and I wouldn't say there's a redemption arc. She does kiss the cross. realize how much Charles loves her, and she kind of like pities him for it. I mean, he remains steadfast through her death and loves her. The story ends badly. And I think that, well, that's pretty much why, one of the reasons a lot of folks don't like this novel. They don't like Madame Bovary. They think it's sad and depressing, and they don't see maybe the dark humor in it or the how it's applicable to today. And I wanted to say, what is relatable about Emma? I'm just going to name off a few quick things because this is just an overview. She has a desire to experience life to its fullest. She has a desire for excitement. She is impatient with the mundane. She's a sensualist. And I think Emma also, she has depression, untreated at that time. What's dislikable about Emma? Let me count thy ways, right? Her poor treatment of Charles, her poor treatment of her own child, Bertha, the indifference towards her child. It's illustrated in here. At one point, the child, Emma is going through one of her many little moods, and the child is just being a typical child, begging for attention, and she just keeps kind of pushing the child away. And so finally she just kind of nudges the child with her elbow, and she doesn't mean to do it, but the child falls and cuts her cheek. So she tells Charles, oh, the child just cut her cheek. She fell accidentally, and she immediately feels bad about it, and Charles puts like a poultice on the child, and she goes to bed. And he sees Emma over the sleeping child looking at her, and his heart is just filled. He's like, oh, that's such a scene of the mother looking at the sick child. And Emma is really just sitting there thinking, damn, that child's ugly. So Emma's got a little bit of an evil streak in her. And so some people just don't like her. Another reason that people don't like her is she dismisses Charles's long-term servant right early in the book. When they go to move from Tos to Yawnville, she just kind of lets the older servant go so she could get her own younger servant. So that's kind of seen as ruthless, because it was an older servant who'd been with Charles forever, and it's just like, I want things my way. That's kind of ruthless. She is selfish, no question, and it's almost bordering on narcissism, but we don't have the DSM-5 out at that time to say whether she was a narcissist or not. But yeah, so, and again, she destroys herself and others for her own ideals, and some people just can't relate to that. So anyway, if you enjoyed this review, please click like, please subscribe. This is my first book review, and I'm looking forward to doing many more. I could probably accomplish one upload a week. Classics, I love the classics. I have hundreds of them here, and I've read them. So if you have any that you would like to have reviewed, click like, subscribe, and leave a comment down in the comments below, and I will answer you. So again, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy Madame Bovary, and if you haven't read it, I hope this inspires you to read it. It's charming, it really is. And so I hope you have an excellent day, and take care. Peace out.